This might sound crazy, but I somehow made it being a 28-year-old father of one without ever once going on a camping trip. And when my friend Caleb found out, he just about blew a gasket. He's a real Bass Pro Shop is my personality kind of guy, and the only person I ever knew who played hunting games on his Xbox. He hadn't been hunting in years, but he'd used to do a ton of camping weekends with the National Guard, and he figured that there was no better buddy bonding method than heading out into the boonies together. So since we were in Buffalo at the time, he said the Catskills were probably the best place to go if we wanted to get as wild as possible while staying close to home. We packed light, drove up in his beat-up truck, and then set out into the woods and found a spot a couple of miles from the trailhead. I had to admit, Caleb had picked out a real nice spot. It was nestled into a small clearing surrounded by pines and maples, and the ground was soft with fallen pine needles, so even without the camping chairs, it made for a good seat, and with a stream gurgling nearby, we had ourselves a supply of fresh water too. Caleb volunteered to set up both tents, so I occupied myself collecting firewood. It felt pretty cool, doing something useful that had contributed to building an actual fire, and as kind of a fire bug during my youth, getting to make a big one was something that I was actually very excited about. And by the time we had it crackling, the night had settled in and Caleb was showing off some of the campfire cooking he'd learned in the Guard. He'd made these things called pudgy pies, which are basically a ton of peanut butter and marshmallow fluff between two pieces of half-stale bread. That might not sound like anything special, but my God, out there in the woods, with the chill of the night setting in, it was one of the best things I've ever had the pleasure of eating. But as we ate, the fire burned down fast, and it wasn't long before we needed to collect more firewood. I volunteered myself, seeing as Caleb had brought all the food on his own dime, and then after getting up from my camping chair, I headed off into the darkness. I'd pretty much cleared the area around the camp, so I had to walk into the trees with my flashlight to find more decently sized pieces. I walked around, stacking pieces in the crook of my arm, and then, all of a sudden, I heard something moving in the darkness ahead of me. I stopped dead and pointed my flashlight ahead of me, expecting to see a deer or something weird, some kind of woodland creature, but there was nothing. Now I called back.
Yo, Kayla, I think there's something out here.
To which then he replied,
Yeah, of course there's something out there, buddy. It's the woods.
And the way he said it had me instantly kind of relaxing, thinking, yeah, I mean, that little thing is probably more scared of me than I am of it. Then after picking up a few more chunks of logs, I made my way back to the camp. Once the fire was roaring again, Caleb cracked open the cooler and we had ourselves a few cold sodas while watching the flames like they were TV. I was just about finished with my soda, so this couldn't have been more than 15 minutes later when me and Caleb heard another sound, closer to the camp this time. We both went quiet and turned our heads in the direction of the sound. Caleb yelled something like,
Hey, ain't nothing here for you, buddy. Just move along now.
And he said it so confidently that I couldn't imagine anything but the hungriest black bear not listening to him. And then a second or two later, we heard these steady footsteps moving away from us. I remember being kind of impressed that it actually worked. I expected Caleb to be pretty pleased with himself, and he didn't look pleased with himself at all. He actually looked spooked. I asked him what was up, and I'll never forget the chill that went through me when he said, That wasn't an animal, buddy. That was a person. I asked how he was sure, and he said the gait was unmistakable, as in like the rhythm of the footsteps told him it was walking on 2 legs and not 4, something I wasn't familiar with in the woods. I got up walking over to his pack and took out the little gun case that he kept his pistol in, and then after taking it out and loading it and tucking it into his jacket, he suggested that we go on a little walk to make sure the area was still clear, and maybe talk to whoever was out there. I'm not gonna lie, walking the woods with an armed man who said that he just wanted to talk to whoever was out there was pretty goddamned wild. But that was Caleb. He's a friendly guy, but boy can he handle himself. He wasn't looking for a fight. Neither of us were about to lay our heads down to sleep without knowing that we were in the clear. Once we were sure the area was clear, we headed back to camp for what Caleb called a Mexican pizza. And then after a couple of beers and a pre-roll that I brought along for old time's sake, we climbed into our tents for some well-deserved sleep. But for me, sleep did not come easy. My little pine needle mattress flattened out within just a few minutes, and even with the sleeping pad that I had with me, the ground was uncomfortably hard to lay on. On top of that, I started hearing sounds outside the tent again. Not as close or rhythmic as the footsteps we'd heard, but enough to have my eyes shooting open every time I heard something a little too loud. I remember listening out for Caleb, thinking, he's got to hear this too, right? But then I suddenly heard him snoring softly in his tent. He was out cold. I lay there telling myself, if Caleb thinks it's safe enough to sleep, then it is. And then after sort of chuckling to myself and feeling like an idiot, I managed to get comfortable enough to feel like I was drifting off to sleep too. But then, I heard it. A distant noise that sounded almost like a faint cry of something alive and in pain. I remember trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or maybe an animal making perfectly normal animal sounds. But then I heard it again. It cut through the silence, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. It sounded almost like a baby crying, like a sharp and intensely disturbing sound that set my nerves on edge to hear it. I sat up, straining to listen while both hearing and feeling my heart rate pick up. Then I heard it a third time, and that time, it was completely unmistakable. It was a high-pitched sob that rose and fell with the baby's breath, and I'm sure you'll know what I mean when I say the sound alone tugged at something primal in me, something which said, "Make it stop." I rushed to put my boots on, then unzipped my tent and rushed over to Caleb's. I guess running woke him up because he asked, "What's going on?" before I even got to his tent. I unzipped it, just enough to be able to see him, and then said, "Shh, listen." We listened in silence for maybe only a second before it sounded again. That same skin-crawling baby's wail. Caleb's eyes went all wide as he pushed himself out of his sleeping bag, and the first thing he went for was his gun. I remember saying, "Bro, it's a kid. I don't think the gun is gonna help." Because my first thought was like, there's a kid out there, lost and afraid, who actually needs our help. But then Caleb says, "That's no kid, buddy. Listen again." And I remember being just about to launch into some counterpoint, something along the lines of, "What the hell are you talking about?" But then the baby cried again, and I caught on to what he meant. There was something wrong with the sound we were hearing, something you didn't notice unless you really listened. The gut reaction I felt masked it, but Caleb was right. There was something off about it, something weirdly hollow. And before I could process it, another cry started, this one from the opposite direction to the first. It sounded identical, the exact same eerie wail as the first, only louder and closer. But then suddenly, the pitch shifted a little, and we realized what we were listening to. They were recordings. Now, I'd like to say that that was a relief, but as you can imagine, there was still the issue of who the F would play the sounds of crying babies in the woods at night. The thought obviously had Caleb going for his gun, and he told me to stay low as he crawled out of his tent and out into the night. He called out something oddly calm considering the circumstances.
All right, we get it, buddy. We'll move along in the morning.
I figured that might make the noises stop, but instead, they only got louder. The recordings of those babies crying kept looping before a third, and then a fourth joined in. They sounded like they were all around us by then, like the whole forest was echoing with the sounds of wailing infants being played on a loop. They started overlapping, blending together as they seemed to get louder and closer. Caleb shouted over them,
They're just trying to scare us, buddy. And if they're not, I got a gun.
He yelled it like he wanted them to hear too, whoever was out there playing those goddamned recordings. And then, all at once, the cry stopped. But the silence that followed was somehow even worse. We kept waiting for the sounds to start up again or for something terrible to happen, like an attack or gunshots or whatever these psychos out there had planned for us. I asked Caleb what the hell we should do, and all he said was leave. The fire had died down and I was about to grab my flashlight when Caleb told me not to. He said he needed our night vision to see what was out there and that flashlights would just make it easier for them to see us. But that meant trying to gather up all our essentials in the near pitch darkness. We took turns, one of us with the gun, the others packing our stuff. Then when Caleb emerged from his tent after being the second one to gather up his things, we made our move. We didn't speak as I followed him through the trees. We moved slowly, heads on a swivel, trying to spot whoever was out there before they spotted us. Caleb had the gun, our only line of defense between us and whatever was out there, and despite the night being pretty cold, I could feel myself sweating. My heart was racing as we pushed through the dark underbrush, and every few steps I thought I saw something. I didn't know if we were going to be attacked, chased, or if we were walking right into a trap and didn't even know it. Caleb said we were moving back towards the trail, which wasn't even that far, but it felt like it took forever to get there. In the darkness, the woods were disorienting, the trees all looking the same. When we finally broke through to the trailhead, the sight of Caleb's truck was a huge relief to the both of us. My hands were shaking real bad as I fumbled the door and climbed into the passenger seat. Caleb didn't hesitate in gunning the engine before we tore down the dirt road with the forest blurring past us. We drove a few miles until we spotted a diner's neon sign flickering in the darkness ahead. Caleb pulled in, killed the engine, and we sat there for a moment, still pretty shaken. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a couple of cars and a delivery truck, so we figured that it was as safe a place as any to hang out until morning. Neither of us was going back out there to collect our gear until the sun was up. A few tense hours later, with neither of us being able to sleep, the diner opened up at 6 a.m. and we headed inside for some breakfast. A few early morning truckers filed in and at the counter as me and Caleb hunched over plates of eggs and bacon. We talked over what had happened in these whispered voices and agreed that someone was obviously trying to scare us off so they could steal whatever we'd left behind. I said something about kicking myself for not standing my ground if that's all they planned, scaring us off, I mean. Caleb said it was better we avoided violence, or we might have ended up in a jail cell instead of eating bacon. I remember looking at the other people in the diner, trying to read their faces. I wanted to ask if they'd heard anything, if they knew about the cries in the woods, but something stopped me. I then asked Caleb if they thought that they knew about what was going on out there, and he agreed they probably did. When we were done, I paid the bill and we stepped back into the parking lot. The drive back to where we'd been camped was a tense one. Then once we'd finished hiking back to the campsite, we found Caleb was right. Our tents had been ransacked. All of our food and beer was gone, along with pretty much everything else of value too. Whoever it was even took the poles out of my tent, and to this day I wonder what they planned on using them for if they didn't take the fabric along with them. Caleb's tent, which was much more expensive and roomy than mine, was gone entirely. And we didn't stick around. Not wanting to leave behind any of our crap, we tossed whatever hadn't been stolen from us onto the fabric of my tent, and then rolled it up and carried it back to the truck before we drove home. Then what happened became just another campfire tale, I guess. We did go camping again. Caleb and I went other places with mutual friends of ours tagging along, but we sure as hell didn't head out into the Catskills anymore. I can tell you that much. A few years back, my wife Gemma and I were headed for a cozy weekend at a cabin in the Catskills when my car crapped out on me about 10 miles outside Tannersville. We've been driving for a couple of hours already, on roads that weave through the forests of upstate New York, when out of nowhere, the dashboard lights flickered and then went dark. I turned the key over a few times, willing her to start up again, but the engine only coughed. Then, without any signal on our phones, we had no choice but to walk someplace to get help. About a mile or two down the road, we found a small auto shop, which honestly felt like a godsend in the circumstances. It was an old, haggard-looking place with grimy windows, but my wife and I didn't mind. We were too happy to have found exactly what we needed when we needed it most. We called out this very cheerful greeting as we walked inside, and then a mechanic promptly appeared from the back. He was probably in his 50s or 60s, and he wasn't nearly as pleased to see us as we were to see him, but we didn't mind, especially when he assured us that he could have our car towed and fixed by the following morning. As we paid, he asked what we were doing in the area. Then, when we mentioned the cabin, he stopped writing on our bill for a moment and just stared at us. He asked where the cabins were, and then we told him, and he paused before saying, "You don't know much about the area, do you?" And we knew that there were cabins to rent at these bargain prices, and we knew it was peaceful and very secluded too, but other than that, we didn't know much at all. The guy gave a sarcastic laugh when we mentioned the bargain prices, and then asked us rhetorically why we thought that was. He then started explaining how the people who lived up around the cabins didn't take kindly to them being built, nor did they take kindly to the people who stayed in them. This was obviously the absolute last thing we wanted to hear. The cabin had been cheaper than many others in the area, but it was still a real nice place that cost us almost $1,000 of our hard-earned cash. We didn't want to just turn tail and run, but there was also the question of how at risk we'd be if we didn't. We asked the mechanic if he thought that we should just cancel, even if it meant losing our money, and he said he wouldn't go that far, not personally anyway, and that as long as we stayed around the cabins and didn't stray too far from the woods, we'd probably be fine. However, he did say that if anything weird started happening around the cabin, if anyone showed up and started trying to intimidate us, that the safest thing to do was to get the hell out of there. He asked if we were armed, and as it happened to be, I brought my cig along just in case there were bears or something. He told me to keep it handy, regardless if we saw or heard anything. And then after waiting for one of his buddies to show up, we managed to get ourselves a ride to the cabin. It was a tense ride, to say the least, not only because I was super wary of what we'd been told, but me and my wife disagreed on whether the warning was actually genuine or not. See, she'd gotten a completely different read on this mechanic and thought his attitude totally flipped on us once he realized we were tourists staying in this nice, pretty much gentrified cabins. She thought that everything he said afterwards was intended to freak us out and spoil our weekend, and how that was a jerk-off thing to do to two oblivious city folks. And as I said, I didn't agree with her at all. Everything he said felt pretty genuine, and if he secretly hated us, fixing us a ride to the cabin sure was a weird way of showing it. We were both still pretty tense as we arrived, but once we got inside, our spirits were lifted immensely. Because not only was the inside just as rustically luxurious as advertised, but a little walk around the perimeter showed nothing but peaceful, barely touched forest. There were no shadowy strangers walking between the trunks, no weird symbols carved into the trees, and while there were plenty of animal noises, they were much more exciting than they were spooky. After our walk, we unpacked our bags and made ourselves some dinner, and then kept on enjoying what we thought would be a weekend of peace and quiet. Part of me kept thinking about the mechanic's warning, but as I said, seeing the place up close and taking a walk around did a lot to calm our nerves. Not to mention, I had my gun with me and I was confident in my ability to defend both of us. If anything went wrong, we'd be fine. At least, that's what we told ourselves the afternoon we arrived. What was supposed to be our first night, but ended up being our last, passed uneventfully but not quietly. The forest itself was super loud, something I really didn't expect. There were crickets, owls, and pretty sure I heard a coyote howl too, but there was nothing that passed over the line from cool to creepy, and both me and Gemma slept pretty well. The next morning we got up, took showers, and made some coffee. And then we sat on the porch looking out into the woods, wondering what the hell we were so spooked about during the previous day. At that point, with the woods all peaceful and with fine weather over us, it was like a little slice of woodland heaven right there in front of us. And then out of nowhere, I saw something that changed everything. Maybe 20 to 30 yards out, there was a tree that looked off. One of the thicker branches near the top looked neatly cut and was leaning at an unnatural angle. After picking myself up from our seat on the porch, I walked into the trees to take a look at it. I quickly realized that there was a log jammed into one of the trees and that it was being sandwiched against the trunk by a long stick that had been weaved between the branches. This probably sounds painfully naive to more rural folks, but when I first looked at it, I didn't realize what I was looking at. I thought it might have been a tree sculpture or something, maybe a Native American thing I hadn't heard of, but then I noticed the wire that had been strung down the tree trunk and it ran off into the underbrush at its base. I took a few more steps along what was roughly a worn trail, following the wire's assumed path with my eyes until I saw it emerge again, only 10 yards ahead of me. It was strung right across the path that I was on, and if I had walked any further, maybe without that coffee, there's a chance that I wouldn't have noticed it at all. But there it was, clear as day, and once I saw it running horizontally across the trail, I realized what it was. It was a trap, and it was intended for us. When I showed Gemma, I saw the look of horror on her face as she too realized what it was. I grabbed the stick and tossed it at the wire, and then when it hit, the wire pulled out the log's support and it came crashing down onto the trail almost exactly where the tripwire had been. Gemma yelped when it hit the dirt, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't majorly freaked out too. If I'd been standing there when it fell, I'd have been a dead man. We took another careful walk around the cabin, eyes glued to the ground when we were moving and then looking up into the trees whenever we were still. We found a pile of stones stacked in an unnatural way, and we both decided it looked suspiciously like a marker of some kind. There was also a strip of cloth tied to a branch not far from the cabin, and we wondered if that too was some kind of marker or indicator. As we walked back to the cabin, we decided that we weren't going to stay for another minute. We packed up the rest of our things and walked all the way back to that auto shop. It took us maybe an hour plus to get there, and I was worried that we might get lost along the way, but after hitting the highway, it was a straight shot to the shop. When we arrived, our car was parked out front, and when we went inside to collect the keys, that same mechanic was there. He took one look at our faces and knew we'd found something out there. We told him all about the trap we'd found in the trees, how it would have done some serious damage if we'd triggered it accidentally. He said he'd never heard about any traps before, but he wouldn't put it past the folks up there to lay a few down. He also said he was glad we were okay, and when we said we were headed home early, he offered to refund the money we paid him to fix the car as a gesture of goodwill. I think he knew that we were decent enough to refuse him, but you could tell that he felt genuinely bad for us on account of how shaken up we were. We appreciated it, we really did, but we've also never returned to that area, and we never intend to. Almost 20 years ago, I joined a volunteer search party looking for a missing kid up in the Catskills. It was a cold morning when I showed up at this place called Platte Clove Valley, a retiree with too much free time on my hands and a nagging need to do something useful with myself. The kid was a 6-year-old boy, last seen chasing a stray dog into the woods. The police had called the volunteers for help, and then myself and about 50 other volunteers answered the call. Under the supervision of cops and professional search and rescuers, we searched all morning without any luck. It rained in the afternoon, and about a dozen people headed home soaking wet. The rest of us were told that we were welcome to carry on searching into the night, so that's what we did. It made for a tough going. It was very cold, it rained again, and the nature of the terrain meant that we were almost constantly walking up one hill after the other. The group spread out in a loose line of these bobbing flashlights, and we called the boy's name over and over, and some of us yelled till we lost our voice. My back got really stiff from the hours of walking, and after a while it started to really hurt, but I kept moving. The thought of some kid out there all alone and afraid kept me going long into the night. I'd like to say that all of my fellow volunteers were good eggs, but one caught my eye early on, and not for the right reasons. He was quiet, kept to himself, and was always lingering at the edge of the group. He wore this faded green jacket, the hood pulled low over his face when it rained, and he moved with a very strange kind of caution about him. I thought that was because he was paying attention to his surroundings, but after a while I wasn't so sure anymore. I didn't know his name, nobody seemed to. He'd shown up with the rest of us, nodded at the police briefing, and then followed along. I didn't notice anything at first, but after a while, I did. He didn't call out for the boy like the rest of us did. He just walked, head down with his hands in his pockets, like he was just sort of going through the motions. And as the night dragged on, our group got more and more tense. Some of us had been there more than 12 hours, and we'd walked miles upon miles of woods without finding anything whatsoever. And there was no sign of the boy. No footprints, no scraps of clothing, nothing. The other volunteers were starting to crack from the exhaustion, and I was feeling it myself. But it wasn't just that. It was that sort of creeping dread that settles in when hope starts to fade, and people start considering the worst. We'd all been so hopeful that morning, but that night, all that cheerfulness was gone and was replaced by something very dark. Around that same time, I noticed the man in the green jacket avoiding a particular stretch of the valley he'd been assigned to search. It was a rocky area, thick with brambles and fallen logs, but it wasn't impassable. We'd been told to check every inch of our grids, but he steered clear, always finding a reason to drift into other areas that were already being covered. At one point, I saw him staring into the ravine that he seemed to be avoiding. His flashlight beam was just kind of lingering on it for a moment before he turned and walked away. I felt my heart sink as suspicion crept into my mind. It wasn't just that he was avoiding it. It was like he knew something we didn't. I tried to shake it off. I was almost completely exhausted, so I was kind of mad at myself for jumping to conclusions. But then I saw him do it a second time, skirting that exact same way near the ravine. I remember watching his steps quicken as he passed it. The other volunteers didn't seem to notice. They were too focused on their own patches of ground, but I did. I kept my eyes on him for a while and then decided to search the ravine myself. I walked down the valley, past the man in the green jacket, and was no more than a few feet into the ravine when I spotted something ahead of me, lit up by the beam of my flashlight. And the sight of it stopped me cold. I remember my flashlight sweeping over the dirt, and there it was, a small blue toy car, half buried in the leaves. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it, because it was the toy the boy had with him when he ran off into the woods. It was scratched, with one wheel bent, but it perfectly matched the description the boy's parents had given. I called out to the rest of the group. The first to arrive was one of the police officers, and I showed him the toy right away. I didn't say anything about the man in the green jacket, not yet. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but most of all I didn't want to stir up trouble in a group that was already on edge. The man in the green jacket reappeared, slipping back into the group like he'd never left. I watched him as he stood at the back, his hood still up and his hands still stuffed deep in his pockets. I was convinced that he'd seen the toy, but had chosen not to report it, and I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I suddenly pulled one of the officers aside, and in a low voice, I told him what I'd seen. I told him how the man avoided the ravine, and how he seemed to know more than he let on. The officer listened and nodded along, then when I was done, he thanked me for letting him know and said he'd discuss what he'd heard with his fellow officers. He didn't do anything right away, so I figured they weren't going to act on the word of some exhausted and half-crazy old person. But a little while later, I saw two officers approach the man in the green jacket. They stepped away from the group, and I couldn't hear what was being said, but I saw the man's shoulders stiffen as he became very defensive. They talked for a few minutes with the man gesturing, and then he turned and walked off into the dark. Around 1 a.m, before I left, I asked the officer what had happened when he spoke to the man in the green jacket. He said the man had been questioned, had denied knowing anything about the boy's disappearance, and had been so offended at having to justify himself that he actually left the search entirely. Now, having made a note of his name on his ID, they knew who he was, but he was unlikely to be questioned unless the investigation pointed in his direction. And I understood. The police can't just arrest someone on some hunch. But on the walk back to my car, I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the green jacket and about that ravine he'd avoided. And the next day I went back for a second day of searching, but the mood seemed to be different. Nobody talked much, there weren't as many smiles, and even when people did, the smiles never seemed to reach their eyes. The man in the green jacket didn't show up again, but his absence felt louder than his presence ever had. One little talk with the cops and he just quit. And it didn't sit right with me, and I don't think it ever will. I didn't find out what happened to the boy or what the man in the green jacket knew, and since he was never arrested, at least to my knowledge, I have to accept that I'm going to die not knowing. And that, my friend, is a very bitter pill to swallow. My name's Rachel, I'm from New York, and I see that you post a lot of hiking and camping stories, so I figured I'd send mine in. I used to do a lot of solo hiking in my early 20s, something I picked up in college and then carried with me into the real world. It was my #1 stress reliever and my chosen method of exercise, but that all changed after a trip to the Catskills, one that ended up being the last solo hiking trip I ever went on. I went to college in Pennsylvania, so while I'd visited a lot of the trails and parks over there, my native New York remained mostly unexplored. That meant my trip to the Catskills in November of 2017, specifically to a place called Blackthorn Ridge, was my first. I enjoyed the exercise aspect of hiking, but sometimes it was the solitude I craved the most, and I'd sometimes shy away from the more pedestrian trails in order to see the less traveled areas of the places I visited. So you can imagine my surprise when, while working through a patch of pine trees, I saw a small leather-bound object sitting at the base of a tree. Being the naturally curious soul that I am, I walked over and picked it up. And while it had obviously been there for a long time, I found that it was in relatively good condition. It was a small leather-bound notebook, and then when I opened it up, I saw it was actually somebody's journal. It felt a little rude and obviously intrusive at first, just kind of reading someone's journal like that. But since the notes seemed to focus on the details of the writer's hike, I figured it wouldn't hurt if I just sort of thumbed through it a little, especially if it meant being able to return their journal to them once I got back home. The first entries I read were pretty ordinary, and mostly talked about being on a winding path through a place called Blackthorn Ridge, which coincidentally was pretty much exactly where I was standing. The notebook's owner was also a solo hiker, and obviously somewhat of a kindred spirit, I guess, because they wrote about the thrill of being out there alone, how beautiful and peaceful it was, and how it was their first time in the area. It was like reading my own story, all written out ahead of time, and I remember thinking how me and this person would probably be good friends should we ever meet one day. I closed the journal, slid it into my jacket pocket, and then carried on hiking along the ridge till I felt the pang of hunger creeping up on me. I stopped near some flat rocks, took out my water bottle and a few snacks, and then as I sat cross-legged on one of the rocks, I just kept reading the journal. I'd already made a note of the person's name, as there was a little note saying, "If lost, please return to X," so I knew exactly where to mail it to once I got back home. But since I was lacking on any reading material, and this person's hiking journal was so relevant, I figured that I'd just keep reading on a little until things got too personal. But things didn't get personal, they just got weird. I remember turning a page and then seeing how the next entry was written way different than the others. Now in short, it was just clipped sentences. The person wrote about how the woods didn't feel so friendly anymore. They wrote how the birds weren't singing anymore and how the squirrels weren't coming down from the trees. But obviously not like I'm doing. All they wrote was no birds, no critters, dead quiet. The next words were predator in area? It seemed very rushed. So I immediately glanced up and started scanning the trees around me, but I didn't get the same impression at all. To me, and I was a pretty experienced hiker at the time, everything seemed fine. The birds were sound, the squirrels were bounding around the forest floor, I could kind of hear them, and I didn't even feel remotely under that threat or in danger. But then, as I read on, I got this creeping feeling up my spine as the hiker's final entry mentioned a place called Hollow Crag. They said that there was this rocky clearing just beyond a meadow where the grass dropped into a shallow basin. All they wrote after that was something like, "Warn any other hikers, stay away." They didn't explain what that exact danger was, they only warned against going there. But those final few words about warning other hikers, about staying away, they looked almost scratched into the page, like whoever had written it was scared out of their minds. I remember closing the journal over and tucking it back into my jacket, and with that creeping feeling working its way up my spine. Not because I feel like I was being watched or anything, or my spidey sense was tingling or anything woo-woo like that. It was because Hollow Crag was on my list of actual destinations that day. I had marked it on my map as one of 5 checkpoints, in an oval-shaped route that'd take me all the way up Blackthorn Ridge and back again. It was supposed to serve as my more than halfway now checkpoint, so unless I wanted to dramatically delay my return home by adding 2 or 3 hours to my journey, I had to pass by Hollow Crag to stay on schedule. I could skirt around it, but I couldn't avoid it, and at the time that seemed like it'd be enough. But looking back on it, I should have just swallowed the loss and resigned myself to hiking the extra hours, because when that journal said to stay away from Hollow Crag, it should have really said avoid it at all costs. I got myself back on the trail so I could better navigate the area, but seeing how far out I was, it was barely any clearer than the terrain on either side of it. Roots were creeping under the soil, and low-hanging branches made it so I had to stoop down while paying extra attention to my footing. I should have been getting pretty tired at that point. I'd been hiking solidly for a few hours, but I was also getting a nice steady hit of adrenaline every time I thought about what was written in that journal. I'd glance over my shoulder every so often, half expecting to see someone following me, but the forest seemed empty, just me and the trees. There was no one in sight, but that didn't mean no one was there, and I remember the moment I heard this loud snap coming from behind me. It sounded like a big branch being ripped from a tree with a ton of force, like this sharp, tearing snap of wood. It sounded like it was maybe 50 yards back, but I didn't stop for a better guess, I guess, and I kept moving, thinking to myself, it's behind you, not ahead of you. You're safe for now. Just keep beating feet. And I started moving a little faster, risking a fall to put some distance between me and whoever made that noise. I kept my ears open for any other sounds too, but aside from my own breathing and footsteps, there was nothing. I knew I should have looked back, just to make sure that it was clear, but I couldn't. I guess there's a part of me that was still pretending it was all just in my head, so I couldn't bring myself to look back. I just kept moving steadily toward a curve in the trail, knowing I'd need to conserve every last ounce of energy if I was going to make a run for it. I sped up a little as I took the curve, but as I reached its end, I found myself faced with thinning trees and a large expanse of open grass. There was a wide, shallow bowl of rock and sparse grass, just as the person's hiking journal had described. It was Hollow Crag, and there was no getting around it. It's not like I wanted to step out into the open, but doubling back meant facing whoever was behind me, so I did the only thing I could and started to cross it. As I walked, my eyes darted toward every flicker of movement as my heart rate began to skyrocket from the terror of being so exposed. Once again, it seemed like I was alone, as I couldn't see anything but grass and tree trunks on the other side of the crag. But I knew that was impossible. I knew there was someone following me. And while I was alone, they weren't. I remember finally being brave enough to turn around and check behind me, but my head only made it 90 degrees before I saw the second guy off to my left. There was some type of figure walking at the far edge of the crag, one that moved out of the tree line and out into the afternoon sun in the moments after I spotted him. He was tall, strong-looking, and had the confidence of an outdoorsman about him, but I could tell right away he was no hiker. His clothes were very wrong. They were tattered, mismatched, like he'd pieced them together from scraps of men and women's clothing. He stopped as soon as he saw me, and I mean it very literally when I say that I felt his eyes on me. All I could do was clutch the straps of my pack and start walking faster, aiming for the trail on the other side. I had hoped that he'd stay where he was, but he didn't. He followed. The second man slipped back into the tree line again, probably in the hopes that I hadn't spotted him right away. Then he moved parallel to me, mirroring my movements as I pushed towards the trail. At this point, my legs were burning from the exertion, and I wasn't even running yet. I knew that, like any predator, running would be the trigger for them to chase me. And when that chase started, it needed to start on my terms, not theirs. The trail was close now, maybe 30 to 40 yards, but I could still see the second man keeping pace to my left, ready to swoop in at any moment. I didn't know who those men were or what they wanted, but the journal's warning screamed in my mind, and I knew I had to move faster. I reached the trail and broke into a jog. Then when I heard a gruff voice behind me yell, "She's getting away!" I burst into a sprint. Even with low branches scratching at my face, and even with my pack bounced painfully against my back, I ran as fast and as far as my legs could carry me, because I'd never been so scared in my entire life in those moments. I needed as much distance between us as possible, but moving faster meant the risk of losing my footing, and unfortunately for me, it didn't take long for that to happen. I remember stumbling over a root and only barely catching myself against a tree, pushing off with my hands that were already scraped and bleeding, and then kept running as my legs and lungs were still burning. I had a nice clear patch at one point, a stretch that I could really get my legs pumping, but it didn't last. The trail suddenly twisted downhill, and while that meant that I was making progress, it also meant that I nearly lost my feet again. That time, I was even luckier not to go tumbling down that slope, which, at that stage, probably could have been fatal. So, in an attempt to stay on more stable ground, I veered off the trail and into the undergrowth, hoping that might help me lose these men chasing me. I don't know how long I ran, but I was at my absolute limit when I finally stopped for what could only be a short break. I was huffing air. My vision was all dizzy as the forest blurred around me, and I fought the urge to puke. My legs obviously were screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, even if the only thing keeping me going was pure terror. I ran until the forest began to thin out and the trees gave way to a gravel path. I followed it, practically staggering from the exhaustion, until I saw a ranger station, a small wooden building with a green door. The relief was overwhelming, so strong that tears started to fill my eyes as my legs felt like they were literally going to give out. I climbed the steps and pounded on that door. No one answered, but the door was unlocked, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. And like any good traumatic event, I got to enjoy a wonderfully horrifying moment of a false ending. Because when I walked inside, I saw that that station was empty. There was no ranger, just a single room with a desk, a radio, and a map of the Catskills pinned to the wall. I locked the door behind me and sank to the floor, keeping my back against it as one final line of defense against anyone that might have followed me. When I heard nothing but silence for what must have been a half hour or so, I took the journal from my jacket and placed it on the ranger's desk. I don't know why I did that at first, but now looking back on it, it feels like I was saying, okay, no more. I give up and I don't want to play anymore. I know it was superstitious, but the sun was already setting when I arrived at the ranger station, and by the time I felt sturdy enough to walk again, it was almost full dark outside. I knew it'd be incredibly stupid to head back out into the woods, so I just stayed there until morning, too afraid to move. And when the sun finally rose up, and there was just enough light coming through the station's small window for me to see, I forced myself to stand again. My body was aching from the previous day, but it was either get on the move or stay there with no food or water for another night. I left the journal on the desk. I didn't want or need it anymore, and besides, the ranger needed to read it a hell of a lot more than I did, I think. And when I stepped outside, the forest was so much more quiet and peaceful than the previous evening that it was like being in a different place altogether. Then, after walking for some time down a large trail, I heard a truck. At first I was about to run, but when I saw the ranger decal, I started frantically flagging them down. The truck stopped and the ranger got out looking startled till I assured him that everything was fine. At least, by then it was fine anyway. I told him about the men near Hollow Crag, how on their own it had been frightening, but coupled with what was in that journal, my mind was spinning and I'd been absolutely scared beyond all comprehension to be up there alone with those weirdos. I didn't know what kind of a reaction I was really expecting, but I definitely wasn't expecting the ranger to just sort of sigh, like it was a pretty regular annoyance for him. Now for me, getting chased off of that area was one of the most terrifying experiences of my whole life, but to the ranger, that was the third time it had happened that year. He laid it out for me as he gave me a ride back to the trailhead. The rangers didn't know much about the men who lived up there, only that they were aggressive and didn't like people passing through. The only attempt to communicate with them had resulted in a warning shot from some kind of bow, one that resulted in an arrow slamming into a tree right close to the ranger's head. So rather than risk a full-blown Ruby Ridge rerun, the rangers decided to just close the trail off and leave them be. That's half the reason it was so overgrown. But the two men up there took down any closed trail signs that rangers tried to put up, which is why I didn't see any heading in. I remember asking the ranger why they'd take the signs down if they didn't want anyone near Hollow Crag there, and he said that he didn't know exactly, but his guess was they hated everything associated with the federal government, cheap plastic signs included. It was a major shock hearing it all like that, and learning so casually that they were just sort of these wild people living up in the mountains and that the government was basically like, okay, whatever, I guess. And that's what really drove it home for me that America is still a wild country, and it's wild in more ways than one. People think of the city as a dangerous place and the country is safe, but that trip to the Catskills made me realize just how wrong that is. Some people are out there far from civilization, living by nobody's rules but their own. And while on paper that might sound cool, the reality can be horrifying for those who actually cross their paths. I've been photographing wildlife around Balsam for years when this happened. Trail cameras were my eyes when I wasn't there, and I'd rig them to the trees and they'd snap motion-triggered shots day and night. Now that summer that this happened, I set up 5 cameras near a stream where bears often wandered, and the plan was simple. I'd leave them for a week, retrieve the footage, and sort through the images for keepers. But I ended up getting way more than I bargained for. The first sign of trouble came when I reviewed the footage back at my cabin. Most of the cameras had captured what I'd hoped for. Bears lumbering through the brush with their eyes glinting that sort of infrared glow. But one camera, tucked much deeper in the woods, showed something else. One night, a man walked into shot, but not some hiker or camper. This guy looked like he'd been living wild for years. His clothes were torn and filthy, and after walking into the shot, he'd started digging in the dirt with his hands, just sort of clawing at the earth like some type of animal. His movements were frantic, almost feral, but he never once looked at the camera, and I assumed that he hadn't seen it. I remember staring at the grainy images, my mouth just kind of hanging wide open, just completely astounded by what I was seeing. Who the hell was he, and what the hell was he doing out there? The footage obviously gave no concrete answers. All I had were pictures of him scraping at the ground in the middle of the night. It wasn't so much what he was doing either, it was the way he was doing it. Something about the way he moved, the way his head twitched as he worked, it scared the crap out of me. So, rather than be in the same section of the forest as this dude, I decided to retrieve the cameras the next day, a whole 2 days earlier than planned. I wanted those images safe, and I didn't like the idea of being alone in the woods with someone like that walking around at night. The next morning, I hiked back to the stream where I'd rigged the cameras. I found the first camera easily, but the second I saw it, my heart sank. The lens was shattered and the casing cracked like someone had taken a rock to it. I checked the next one and found the same thing. Someone had smashed it to pieces. By the third one, my hands were already shaking with anger. 4 out of 5 were ruined, with their memory cards either missing or found crushed on the ground where they'd been rigged. Only one camera, deepest in the woods, was still intact. I hesitated before checking it, as part of me wanted to grab it and just leave, but I needed to know what was on it. So I popped out the memory card and slid it into my portable viewer. The first few clips were normal, just animals of varying shapes and sizes. And then I saw him, the same man in the same tattered clothes, but this time, he wasn't digging. He was standing right in front of the camera, staring into the lens. His face filled the frame, very pale, gaunt-looking, with big dark circles under his eyes. His lips moved like he was muttering something, but the camera didn't pick up sound. His eyes locked onto the lens like he knew something was watching. I shut off the viewer, yanked the camera from the tree, and then got the hell out of there. I stuffed the camera in my backpack and started back toward the trailhead. My car was a 2-mile hike away, but every step felt like it took forever. The forest didn't feel peaceful at all anymore. Now, I couldn't shake the image of that guy's face and the way those hollow eyes seemed to stare right through the lens. What did he want? Why had he smashed the cameras? And why had he left that one, the one with a video of him? It almost felt like a message, and one that was easily understood. It clearly said, "Leave now." And I tried to reassure myself, thinking that maybe he was just some hermit spooked by the cameras, but deep down, I knew better. He looked right at me through the lens. He'd clearly wanted me to see him. After an hour or so of very tense walking, the trail opened up and I saw the faint outline of the clearing where I'd parked. I walked over to my car, and then when I reached it, I glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see him staring back at me. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. But I knew he was out there, and that was enough to send a shiver through me. I climbed into the car, slammed the door and locked it, and I drove all the way home without stopping. I didn't go back to Balsam after that. The footage from the last camera stayed on the memory card unviewed, and I couldn't bring myself to watch it again and see his face. I packed up my gear and moved my work to a different range, far from those woods. The bears of Balsam Lake would have to wait. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to send them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access and all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button here on YouTube to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. And I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the only way out is up.